Welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today we're discussing the Beach Boys compilation album Endless Summer, released on June 24th, just as the summer of 1974 was getting underway. For reference, in these 5 cubicles, I've placed some of the new and notable albums that you might have seen on sale at the record store had you walked in to pick up a copy on the day of release. I doubt many people did that. Unlike an album of new material, which hardcore fans would pick up right away, a compilation album like this would need a bit of promotion for it to really catch on. Normally, I wouldn't devote an entire episode to a compilation album. The Beach Boys have had dozens, maybe hundreds of them around the world over the years. Endless Summer, however, is clearly in a class by itself, both in terms of its success and its impact on the future of the band. I'm not sure, but I've always thought that the Beach Boys double best of concept came to Capitol in part due to the huge success they'd had a year earlier with the Beatles double sets 1962 to 1966 and 1967 to 1970, which much later became known as the Red and Blue albums. The release was undoubtedly also meant to tie into the 50s nostalgia craze of the time. Of course, the Beach Boys weren't the 50s, but the craze really extended to anything pre-Beatles, as had been shown by the inclusion of their music in the hit film American Graffiti, released about 10 months earlier. Not coincidentally, Endless Summer began with Surf and Safari and ended with All Summer Long, the 2 Beach Boys songs featured in the movie and on the hit soundtrack album. It was also Capitol responding to the success of the recent Beach Boys double live set, The Beach Boys in Concert, which had gotten good reviews, gone to number 25 on the chart, and helped revive the group as a hot commodity. This is the first Beach Boys album I ever bought. At the time, I had just turned 14 and had been a serious record collector for about 4 months. Buying records on my allowance made it slow going. The collection I'd put together at that point consisted of Buddha and the Chocolate Box, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, John Denver's Greatest Hits, the Beatles 1967 to 1970, which I later sold, and Caribou, which had been a present for my 14th birthday. And thanks again, Mrs. Wilde, I am still enjoying it. That summer, I was keeping a close eye on new releases at the record store and my ear glued to FM rock radio. I was certainly aware of Endless Summer from seeing it on prominent display at the mall record stores that I used to go to in those days. Where I really became aware of it was from the television commercial, which finally convinced me to buy it in August 1974. It wasn't unusual for records to be advertised on television in those days, though you would rarely, if ever, see those commercials during prime time. Rather, they'd be on during late afternoon reruns or late nights when advertising rates were cheaper and they thought young people would be watching, particularly, as you might guess, on rock music shows like In Concert and the Midnight Special. In an article in the August 17th edition of Billboard, Capitol's national marketing coordinator, Phil Caston, confirmed that local television spots were key to promoting Endless Summer. He said there were 2 generations of Beach Boy fans, those who had been fans for 12 years and the younger kids. The commercials were aimed at the 14 to 28-year-old demographic and therefore were running on late movies and music-oriented shows. I saw a lot of record commercials on TV during those years, but of all the records in my collection, I'd say that Endless Summer is the only one that I bought primarily based on a TV commercial. For me, as a 14-year-old, up late watching some low-grade science fiction movie on a hot August Saturday night, presented by our local horror host, The Ghoul, seeing that commercial and hearing that sunny music really captured my attention. The concept of an endless summer held a particular appeal for me as someone terrified at the prospect of starting their first year of high school in just a few short weeks. An endless summer sure sounded sweet. I knew the music was old, but the cover made it look okay. The guys on the cover had long hair and beards, and the bright, colorful illustrations made it look whimsical and modern. It may be hard to appreciate now, but in 1974, a period-appropriate cover like these fantasy covers would have sent me, and I'm sure a lot of other young listeners, running for the hills rather than be seen buying old music. The 50s craze really didn't extend to adopting 50s styles. In 1974, nobody was getting a crew cut or abandoning their big bells and platform shoes for straight-legged trousers and penny loafers. I think it was extremely important that the album looked contemporary, even though everyone knew the music was vintage. You wouldn't be embarrassed to be seen buying this or carrying it around the halls at school. I suppose the faces on the cover also prepared new fans for the look of the group they'd be seeing in concert if they bought tickets. The title was a good choice. If the phrase was known at all, The Endless Summer was known as the title of Bruce Brown's landmark 1966 surfing documentary. Mike Love never tires of pointing out that he suggested the title to Capitol, who, he says in at least one quote I read, were going to call it The Best of the Beach Boys Volume 3. Of course, Capitol had already released an album with that title in 1968, which Mike understandably had probably forgotten. There would have been far too much overlap with the first 3 volumes for them to have called it Best of the Beach Boys Volume 4. In any case, Endless Summer is certainly a much more attractive title than another Best of, Greatest Hits, or Definitive Collection. From seeing the crawl of titles and hearing the sound clips on the TV commercial, it appeared to be a definitive hits collection, so the Endless Summer title didn't obscure that you were getting the hits. While Surfer Girl played under it, the commercial voiceover told us, 20 of your favorite original Beach Boys hits are now together in a fabulous 2-record set called Endless Summer. Later, while Help Me Rhonda played, it concluded, The Beach Boys Endless Summer, 20 original hits by the Beach Boys, specially priced in a 2-record set with free Endless Summer poster inside. Enjoy Endless Summer with the Beach Boys on Capitol Records and Tapes. As the commercial made clear, Endless Summer was available as a 2-record set, or on 8-track and cassette, which were pretty much the standard formats in those days. Of the 20 tracks, 7 were top 10 hits, 5 had gone top 40, and there were 8 others. All tracks, with the arguable exception of Surfin' USA, based on Sweet Little 16 and now credited solely to Chuck Berry, were Beach Boys originals. As Betamax Blocker pointed out to me when we talked, Endless Summer remains the only major Beach Boys compilation to contain no cover songs. Of course, with Warner Reprise having the rights to the Beach Boys post-1965 material at that time, you would eventually realize, like I did, that it didn't contain some key tracks like Good Vibrations, Wouldn't It Be Nice, and Sloop John B. If a fan examined it closely, they'd have realized that there were 5 top 40 hits from those early years that Capitol had omitted. When I Grew Up to Be a Man, Dance, 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 and Barbara Ann, all of which had gone top 10, and Do You Wanna Dance and The Little Girl I Once Knew, both of which went top 20. It's possible that Capitol thought these would have had more limited appeal than some of the tracks they chose, or maybe they were keeping a few tracks in reserve for a possible Volume 2. I know sometimes with these things, some of it just comes down to which tapes they can easily locate. Of course, with the success of Endless Summer, there will be a Volume 2 in 1975 in the form of the Spirit of America collection, which will include all 5. Of the remaining 8 tracks on Endless Summer, Catch a Wave, Warmth of the Sun, Girls on the Beach, All Summer Long, and Wendy, which had gone to number 44, might not have been major hits, but were familiar key Beach Boys tracks. To me, the most unusual choices were the Summer Days and Summer Nights album tracks, Let Him Run Wild, Girl Don't Tell Me, and You're So Good to Me. They're great tracks, of course. My guess is they're included by virtue of being some of the most Beatlesque and most contemporary sounding of the tracks available to Capitol. Also, in the absence of anything from Pet Sounds, they provided a showcase for Brian as a pop love song writer. Famously, both Be True to Your School and Help Me Rhonda are the early album versions rather than the hit single versions. This has always been chalked up to errors by Capitol in choosing the tapes, but I suspect in the case of Be True to Your School, it might have been deliberate. Keeping in mind the tenor of the times, I think my 14-year-old self would have found the single version with the Honeys vocals to be unbearably corny and deathly embarrassing in 1974. I think most listeners would have found the more direct, unadorned album version more palatable at the time. Endless Summer not being a definitive hits collection probably had a distinct upside for the Beach Boys. I'm sure there are a lot of others like myself who realized they still didn't have Good Vibrations or Wouldn't It Be Nice and were motivated to buy additional Beach Boys records. Of course, as we're discussing in the 1974 episodes, Warner Reprise were ready, reissuing all 5 of their late 60s albums during the year. When the album was released on CD in 1987, Good Vibrations was added as a bonus track. A Digital Compact Classics audiophile CD reissue in 1995 also included Good Vibrations and swapped out the album versions for the single versions of Be True to Your School and Help Me Rhonda. Like their recent double album, The Beach Boys in Concert, the original release came with sides 1 and 4 on one album and sides 2 and 3 on the other. As mentioned before, this was a time when automatic changers were common on stereos, and it allowed you to stack the album so you could play sides 1 and 2, then flip them both over to play sides 3 and 4. 5 tracks per side looked about right in 1974, at a time when it wasn't unusual for songs to go past the 6-minute mark. With Help Me Rhonda being the only song on Endless Summer over 3 minutes, and most closer to the 2-minute mark, it was skimpier in practice than it appeared on the record sleeve. Even a fairly novice record buyer like I was in 1974 could literally see the difference. The grooves on the 4 sides of Endless Summer were noticeably less dense and more matte than on most 1974 rock albums like Gordon Lightfoot's Sundown and Paul McCartney and Wings' Band on the Run, which were more typical, and the 2 biggest albums on the chart when Endless Summer was released. In these side-by-side comparisons, you have Endless Summer sides on the left and Band on the Run or Sundown on the right. The easiest place to see the difference is in the play-out groove between the last song and the label. Obviously, Endless Summer has longer play-out grooves. What's harder to see here is the tracks on Endless Summer look noticeably lighter than most contemporary albums because the grooves were more widely spaced. The playing time of Sundown is 17 minutes and 2 seconds for side 1 and 19 minutes and 10 seconds for side 2. Both sides of the American version of Band on the Run are over 22 minutes. The playing time for Endless Summer sides ranges between 12 minutes and 25 seconds for side 4 and 10 minutes and 1 second for side 2. All of Endless Summer could have fit comfortably on one record. In the UK, the album came with the same gatefold cover, but contained a single album with 10 tracks per side. As the commercial pointed out, the set was specially priced, less than most double albums, but still more than a single album. The album also came with a poster. In keeping with the no period appropriate picture theme, it wasn't a picture of the group. It wasn't even a copy of the cover illustration, which might have been kind of nice. Instead, it was a picture of the 2 planes trailing the banners as seen in the TV commercial, making it one of the least useful and least attractive posters ever included in an album package. I suspect that more used copies of Endless Summer still have the poster than most albums because very few people would have been motivated to hang it. The poster was forgettable and the album sides were short, but I loved the music. I recall several people saying that every record collection should include some Beach Boys, and in 1974, this seemed like the perfect choice to fill that gap. Of course, I was far from alone. To practically everyone's surprise, it becomes a smash hit, picking up momentum as the summer goes along and hitting number 1 on October 5th. It's the Beach Boys' first top 20 album since Best of the Beach Boys went to number 8 back in 1966, and their only number 1 album apart from Beach Boys Concert in 1964. On July 29th, Capitol reissues Surfin' USA with The Warmth of the Sun on the B-side to tie in with the Endless Summer collection. Surfin' USA will go to number 36 on September 28th. Not a particularly huge hit, but it does mark their first time in the top 40 since I Can Hear Music in 1969. While the level of Endless Summer's success may have been surprising, it wasn't entirely unforeseeable. Nostalgia aside, the Beach Boys' reputation as an outstanding concert attraction had been growing for the last several years. If you followed rock music at all, you had probably heard somewhere along the line that the Beach Boys had turned into a great band. And of course, everybody could hear proof on The Beach Boys in Concert, which had been released just a few months earlier. They had been reintroducing more of their early crowd-pleasing hits into their set lists. Audiences had been growing, and now, with the success of Endless Summer, things really take off. As discussed last time, when the album was released, they had already committed to opening for Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young on their tour of stadiums for a large part of the summer. The August 17th Billboard article mentioned earlier speculates that the Beach Boys had recently received increased radio play due in part to touring with Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and their participation in that tour was also contributing to the success of Endless Summer. When the Beach Boys complete their run with CSNY, they begin headlining larger venues, a trend that will continue for a long time. With no new material to promote and crowds clamoring for the kind of songs they were hearing on Endless Summer, it seems inevitable that the Beach Boys would give the people what they want and play the oldies. As we've discussed, with Jack Riley out of the picture and Blondie Chaplin having quit the band at the end of 1973, the Beach Boys' early 70s hippie period was clearly over. As great as some of their early 70s material had been, they had always had to contend with crowds shouting out requests for Barbara Ann. Additionally, times and styles had changed. Even without the personnel changes, the Beach Boys now needed to reinvent themselves again already for the post-hippie, post-protest, glam-influenced mid-70s. Behind the scenes, of course, the band had already fractured into camps that were unlikely to agree on a direction, and with Brian on the sidelines, nobody was strong enough on their own to forge a path for the others to follow. Endless Summer may have hastened the process of the Beach Boys becoming an oldies act, but as we'll see over the course of the next couple of years, it's mainly because the group failed to follow it up with worthwhile new material of their own. They'll still make some decent records, even some excellent records. Later in the decade, they'll make some effort to model themselves on more mature, sophisticated, and successful rock acts like Chicago, but with no steady direction or drive, the Beach Boys will largely become an oldies act that occasionally releases a new record to promote on tour. It's unfortunate, but I think it's understandable that the Beach Boys would eventually tire of the struggle to come up with progressive new material, the struggle amongst themselves over their direction, and the struggle with audiences over what songs to play, especially when it becomes apparent that they can easily play the oldies to large, appreciative crowds, and importantly, larger paydays. I suspect that without Endless Summer, the Beach Boys would have largely become an oldies act eventually anyway. Endless Summer may have brought that day a little sooner, but it ensured at least that they would be a popular oldies act. For me, and I suspect for a lot of people of my generation, Endless Summer served as an on-ramp to the Beach Boys' music. I was new to record buying in 1974, so there was a lot for me to explore, and it would take a while before I got around to seriously checking out the Beach Boys' back catalog. But in 1974, listening to The Warmth of the Sun or the opening of California Girls in the headphones late at night, I was aware there was magic there. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. As always, I look forward to your perspective and your feedback. I hope you'll join me next time when we will begin wrapping up the year 1974 with a look at October, November, and December. Have a great week. Bye.